April 10, 1941. The Independent State of Croatia emerged as World War II raged, a Nazi puppet state marked by its fascist and ultranationalist visions. But soon after its establishment, a web of dark secrets began to unravel, many of which shocked the world. Its concentration camps, like those of Nazi Germany, were meant to exterminate the minorities living within its nation. Jasenovac Concentration Camp was chief among these, shrouded in infamy and terror. Even Nazi officials shied away from it, unable to comprehend the level of brutality and death unleashed there. How could the world silently watch the horrors occurring behind its gates? And were the perpetrators ever punished? A dark wind rises, the establishment of the Jasenovac Extermination Camp. The Holocaust is widely considered one of the darkest chapters in our collective human history. During the few years of World War II, the Holocaust emerged with its complex system of concentration camps that appeared to be internment camps, but concealed death, murder, and extermination. Some of the most notorious camps existed in Nazi Germany and rose to infamy, most notably Auschwitz and Dachau. But while these camps were characterized by incredible brutality and sheer numbers of victims, there was one extermination camp that was far worse and even shocked the Nazi officials who visited it. It was called Jasenovac. Located in the Nazi puppet state of the Independent State of Croatia, the Jasenovac extermination camp was the site of unspeakable atrocities. The puppet state of Croatia was created in April 1941 following the swift and brutal Axis invasion of Yugoslavia. The Independent State of Croatia, as it was known, was led by the Ustaše movement. This was an ultranationalist and fascist movement, heavily inspired by and supported by Benito Mussolini's regime. The movement's main goal was to establish the nation of Greater Croatia, which would be ethnically pure, similar to National Socialist Germany. But to create this pure nation, the Croats were determined not to deport or assimilate the minorities living in their country, but to exterminate them all. Their primary target was the Serbs, Orthodox Slavs, who shared many cultural traits with the Croats themselves. But for the latter, this mattered little. They were Catholics and believed that there was no place for religious or ethnic minorities in their nation. Other ethnic groups targeted, in addition to Serbs, were Jews, Roma and Croat and Bosnian political dissidents. Simply put, Jasenovac was established as a means of exterminating all those who did not fit into the Ustaše plan for a Greater Croatia. These policies were directly related to the infamous visions of Nazi leader Adolf Hitler. Ustaše leader Ante Pavelić directly aligned all of his visions and ideals with those of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, but took them to an even more extreme level. Pavelić, like his Croatian subordinates, lacked the elaborate systems of industrial extermination for which the Germans were known. In contrast, the Croats were not lacking in brutality and did not hesitate to commit some of the worst atrocities the world had ever seen, all in the most primitive ways possible. To achieve this, they established the Jasenovac Extermination Camp in August 1941, which soon became the focal point of all their genocidal goals. The blood of the innocents, the extermination of minorities. The Jasenovac camp was initially conceived as a way to deal with political dissidents in Croatia, especially those with ties to communism. The camp was located about 100 kilometers southeast of the Croatian capital, Zagreb, and strategically positioned along the Sava River. This was done as a way to quickly dispose of bodies, dumping them in the nearby wide and deep river. But the Ustaše quickly changed their hellish plans. They realized that those who opposed their regime wouldn't be the only ones there. Instead, Jasenovac would become the place where all the unwanted would be killed. And so the campaign of death began. Jasenovac was, in many ways, a Croatian solution to what they called the Serbian problem. For many generations before the start of World War II, Croats had developed an anti-Serb sentiment within their nation. They viewed the Serb minority, which had lived in Croatia for centuries, even before the Croatian nation existed, as a threat to their ideological plans for Greater Croatia. For them, prosperous Serbs and their political consciousness were seen as a clear obstacle on the path to a large and unrestricted Croatian state. And so they decided to unleash their hatred on these people, killing a third of them, expelling another third, and forcibly converting the rest to the Catholic faith. It was a brutal and bestial plan that went against everything human. And to achieve their goals, the Ustase stopped at nothing. They showed no mercy to anyone on their path of devastation. Women, children, the elderly, and the sick, all were killed without hesitation as long as they were not Croats. It was a time of tragic loss of life, a descent into madness and depravity, into bloodshed and primitivization, which the world was forced to watch in silence. And those poor souls who found themselves at the center of it all were at the end of a knife's blade. The cries of tortured souls, imprisonment in Jasenovac. In its purest and most vile form, Jasenovac was an extermination camp. However, it also functioned as a labor camp where many of those imprisoned endured forced labor that often led to their deaths. Of those imprisoned here during the war, the largest ethnic group was Serbs. The Jasenovac complex was not a single compound, but a structured system of at least 5 main sub-camps distributed along both banks of the Sava River. The central core of the complex was located at the confluence of the villages of Jasenovac and Ustica, covering an estimated area of over 210 hectares, making it one of the largest camps in Eastern Europe. This decentralized layout made it possible to conceal specific activities, disperse prisoners, and hamper external assessment of the entire extermination system. Each subcamp served a clearly assigned function. Jasenovac 1, Krapje, and Jasenovac 2, Brokic, were the first to be established, primarily serving infrastructural work such as land leveling, facility construction, and draining marshy areas. Later, Jasenovac 3 Siglana was established, known as the Central Operational Core, housing the administrative facilities, general detention barracks, and the brick factory used for both production and forced labor. The tannery Kozara, or Jasenovac 4, served as an additional industrial unit with prisoners assigned to manual labor in unsanitary conditions. Finally, Stara Gradiska, Jasenovac 5, located across the river, was primarily used for the imprisonment and execution of women and children. The materials used for construction were rudimentary. The barracks were made of baked brick or low-quality wood covered with roofs of tin or reused tiles. Internal divisions were minimal, and dormitories accommodated up to 100 people per space designed for fewer than 30. The camp perimeter was fenced with multiple lines of barbed wire, reinforced in some sections with containment ditches and elevated guard posts. The internal roads were made of compacted earth, and sanitary facilities were virtually non-existent. The execution areas were far from the administrative areas. In Gradina, on the other side of the river, dozens of mass graves were dug in open fields, with access paths hidden among dense vegetation. This intentional layout allowed the extermination to be kept out of sight of the rest of the inmates, contributing to the control of the camp through isolation and misinformation. The architectural layout of Jasenovac did not follow the German industrial model, but did respond to a logic of serial killing adapted to the geographical environment and the available material resources. Viewed by the Ustasi as the main obstacle to all their socio-political goals, they were mercilessly persecuted. Before World War II, Serbs lived in the region of Croatia for many centuries. Many of them were part of the military frontier of the Habsburg monarchy and, later, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and enjoyed various privileges in exchange for their military service in the defense against the Ottomans. The frontier was established in 1553 and dissolved in 1881. During those centuries, Croats planted seeds of hatred against Serbs who were exempt from taxes due to their valiant service. This hatred never ended, and during the Ustasi era it only burned brighter. And when the horrors of war began, the Croats took up arms and descended upon their Serbian neighbors, displaying a disturbing level of brutality against these innocent and simple peasants. In Jasenovac alone, it is estimated that more than 100,000 Serbs lost their lives, many of them in the most atrocious ways imaginable. Another ethnic minority in the independent state of Croatia that was specifically targeted was the Jewish minority. Before the war, they numbered around 40,000 nationwide, and the Ustase were determined to exterminate them all, following in the footsteps of their Nazi masters. Jews who were in Croatia in 1941 were systematically rounded up and immediately deported to Jasenovac. Many of them were murdered upon arrival, while others were forced into grueling slave labor that eventually took their lives. The Jews were treated the same as others suffering under the German Final Solution program. However, the added brutality of the Ustasi only worsened their plight. And just as in Germany, the Roma, who were disparagingly called gypsies, became another prime target for extermination in World War II Croatia. These nomadic people lived throughout the Balkan region and numbered several thousand in the independent state of Croatia. Hated above all, they were subjected to the worst possible tasks and then ruthlessly exterminated. Generally, they were employed in menial and gruesome labor, such as digging graves, disposing of bodies, and similar tasks. It is estimated that more than 25,000 Roma were murdered at Jasenovac, making it the largest site of Roma genocide during the entire war. In addition to these minorities, the Ustasi also imprisoned and murdered their political opponents. This included political dissidents, communists, local partisans, and anti-fascists. Anyone who resisted their regime or opposed their ideas was marked for death. Among these unfortunate souls were many priests, intellectuals of the time, and other enemies of the state who dared to stand in the way of death and destruction. The Ustasi cared nothing about the ethnicity of these political opponents. Among them were Croats, as well as Muslims, Catholic priests, and many others. Simply put, if someone was disloyal to the ultranationalist ideas of the independent state of Croatia, they were destined to die. Horror behind closed doors, the brutality at Jasenovac. From its inception, Jasenovac began with ferocious brutality. The way the Ustasi treated prisoners was truly horrific, even compared to the horrors of the Holocaust in Europe. The main aspect of this was the mode of killing people. The Nazis had their industrialized methods of extermination, such as gas chambers. Lacking these methods, the Ustasi resorted to the most primitive and atrocious cruelty. They killed their victims with straightforward methods, using hammers, knives, axes, and blunt weapons. This resulted in a level of horror such that even some experienced Nazi officers were shocked upon visiting Jasenovac. They fled in horror, stating that such a level of brutality was too much to bear. However, behind closed doors, death reigned. Prisoners were constantly brought to Jasenovac, and most of them were Serbs, usually from rural Croatia. Many were also brought from occupied territories, especially from the Sirmia region of Serbia. At the camp, they were subjected to a combination of forced labor, torture, starvation, humiliation, and execution. The campgrounds were divided into several subcamps, each serving a specific function in this dark system. Some of these included the Ustica subcamp for Roma internees, the Stara subcamp for Roma, Gradiska, where women and children were imprisoned and murdered, Kozara, the fourth subcamp, and the infamous Gradina execution grounds, among others. Death was a daily occurrence in this camp. Executions were carried out every day, often at the whim of the sadistic camp commandants. Roma were often employed to dig mass graves, and prisoners were lined up in them and hacked to death with sledgehammers. To speed up the extermination process, the Ustasi developed a special killing knife, which they infamously called the Serb cutter. This was originally a knife for cutting wheat sheaves, manufactured in Germany by the Gebruder Company, Grefrath, and marketed under the name Greviso. However, the Ustasi found a new use for it, and it soon became the primary tool of death at Jasenovac. It allowed innocent people to quickly have their throats cut. Unlike Nazi camps such as Auschwitz or Majdanek, where an industrial extermination machinery based on toxic gases, sealed chambers, and systematized crematoria was developed, the Jasenovac camp was characterized by the extensive use of manual and direct methods of murder, which set it apart even within the Axis camp system. Executions were not only constant, but carried out with primitive and mechanical brutality, using common agricultural or industrial tools adapted exclusively for murder. A leather strap allowing for quick, repeated cuts at the neck. Its design allowed for rapid throat cutting without losing grip, and was especially used in mass killing competitions between camp guards. In addition to knives, tools such as blacksmiths' hammers, masons' mallets, shovels, axes, and wood saws were systematically used. These objects were applied directly to the prisoners' heads, torsos, or limbs. The use of blunt tools served a dual purpose. It allowed killing without the need for bullets, which were more expensive and scarce, and it facilitated a silent process inside the camp. Shovels were used both to dig mass graves and to beat prisoners before burying them, often still alive. Toxic gases were used in limited and rudimentary ways. The use of Zyklon B was reported in the Stara subfield, Gradiska, where children and women were locked in attics or sealed rooms and exposed to gas from open cans. Experiments were also made with closed trucks with the exhaust pipes directed to induce carbon monoxide asphyxiation. However, these methods never reached the regular operational scale of the German camps. The great difference between Jasenovac and the Nazi extermination camps lay in the direct contact between executioner and victim. While the Nazis delegated much of the murder process to automated systems that depersonalized the act, at Jasenovac, the murder was physical, visible, and explicit. This not only increased the level of sadism recorded, but also consolidated an environment in which death became a daily practice of interaction between perpetrators and prisoners. Those few who survived the hardships at Jasenovac described the absolute horrors they witnessed. A Croatian Catholic friar who witnessed one of the Ustazi massacres wrote of it, truly horrified. He wrote, "People were captured like beasts, murdered, killed, thrown alive into the abyss. Women, mothers with children, young men, girls and boys were thrown into pits." The deputy mayor of Mostar, Mr. Baljic, a Muslim, publicly declares, although as an official he should keep silent and not speak, that in Ljubinja alone 700 schismatics, i.e. Serbian Orthodox Christians, were thrown into a pit. 6 whole wagon loads of women, mothers and girls, children under 10 years old, were taken from Mostar and Kapeljina to the Surmanci station, where they were unloaded and taken to the hills, with living mothers and their children thrown over the cliffs. All were thrown in and killed. In the parish of Klepchi, from the nearby villages, 3,700 schismatics were killed. Poor souls, they were calm. I will not list any more. Would spread too far. In the city of Mostar, hundreds were tied up, taken out of the city, and slaughtered like animals. The guards were infamous for their gambling, as they later admitted in court. They often competed to see who was the better butcher, in their own words. To determine this, they saw who could kill the most prisoners in the shortest amount of time. In one infamous incident that horrified the post-war world, an Ustase guard named Petar Brzica killed over 1,360 people in one night using a Serb cutter knife. For this macabre achievement, the guard received a bottle of wine, a roast pig, and a gold watch. Brutality beyond belief, the terror of the guards. The camp overseers were some of the most notorious war criminals at Jasenovac. Those in the most important positions were often hardened sadists and did not hesitate to display absolute cruelty. Moreover, they acted on their own, ordering deaths and exterminations at will. Perhaps the most infamous overseer at the camp was Brother Satan, Fra Sotona, a Franciscan friar named Miroslav Filipovic. Born in 1915 in Jajci, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Filipovic pursued a career in the Catholic Church but was quickly expelled due to his violent and extreme temper. Still, he retained his friar's habit and joined the Ustase regime, quickly rising through the ranks to become a military chaplain. His sadistic and ruthless nature made him an ideal member and candidate for Jasenovac. The operational functioning of the Jasenovac Concentration Camp depended on a defined hierarchical structure, albeit less bureaucratic than that of the German camps. Throughout its existence, it is estimated that between 1,500 and 1,800 Ustaz personnel were part of the complex's active staff, including both permanent officers and rotating members of paramilitary units. Unlike the German SS model, Croatian officials had greater discretion in decision-making and execution, with little external control and occasional supervision by the Ustase High Command in Zagreb. The internal hierarchy was organized into several levels. At the top was the camp commandant, Zapovjednik Logora, with both military and administrative functions. Under his authority were the deputy commandants in charge of specific subcamps such as Stara Gradiska or Ciglana. At the operational level, the bulk of the personnel consisted of armed guards, kuvari, responsible for prisoner control, perimeter patrols, and execution of orders. There were also specialized executioners assigned to daily extermination tasks and barrack chiefs, Logorski Starosina, whose role was to enforce internal discipline, distribute tasks, and organize inmates by function or ethnic group. The system also included collaborationist capos, prisoners who received basic privileges in exchange for controlling and informing on their fellow inmates. Although their exact number varies according to records, it is estimated that they represented approximately 3% of the total inmates. Unlike the Nazi camps, where capos were selected according to administrative criteria, at Jasenovac this selection was often based on the degree of submission to the regime and the willingness to actively participate in punishments or executions. After the war, post-war trials documented that less than 10% of the total Jasenovac personnel were identified, captured, and prosecuted. Most of the top commanders were tried and executed, while hundreds of guards and subordinates escaped through protection rackets or reintegrated into the civilian population. This low prosecution rate reflects both the systematic destruction of records and the volatility of the subsequent political environment in Yugoslavia. In 1942, he was appointed commandant of Jasenovac, where he quickly gained an infamous reputation. He committed all kinds of atrocities while dressed in his immaculate Franciscan habit and powdered face. He was known for his effeminate voice and demeanor, which only added to his disturbed personality. He regularly ordered mass executions, which he himself admitted after the war. And he didn't just order the executions, he carried them out. Brother Satan was known to kill with his bare hands and would bet to see if he could stab a tossed child on the first try. Even the other Ustasi guards considered him particularly infamous and strange. He was known to calmly look down on the people he had murdered, saying, "Justice has been done." After the war, Filipović was captured, tried, and confessed to all the atrocities he was accused of. He was sentenced to death by hanging. Another figure of horror was Ante Vrban, a guard at the Stara Gradiška subcamp. Born in 1908 in Croatia, he was an early adherent of the Ustasi movement and had murdered Serb neighbors in his village in the Lika region when the war broke out. Over time, he became deeply committed to the Ustasi's genocidal policies and soon found himself in Jasenovac, its most notorious subcamp, reserved for children. The atrocities he committed there earned him a place among the most despised figures in the history of World War II. Vrban showed no mercy to prisoners, not even children. During his time at Jasenovac, he oversaw the execution of thousands of Serbian, Roma, and Jewish children, many of whom were part of his experiments with rudimentary gas chambers. Vrban was familiar with the German gas Zyklon B and wanted to use it at Jasenovac. To do so, he locked children in an attic in what was known as the infamous Tower. Groups of up to 600 children at a time were locked in and asphyxiated with canisters of Zyklon B thrown into the room. Other prisoners were also asphyxiated, locked in vans with exhaust pipes directed inward, acting as primitive gas chambers. Under Vrban's supervision, approximately 2,000 children were murdered in the Gradiška subcamp in May and June 1942. After the war, Vrban was tried and admitted to murdering a large number of children, describing in detail his methods. He was executed after the trial, and his actions remain a stark reminder of the levels of depravity on display at Jasenovac. Another key figure at Jasenovac was Ljubo Milos. Near the top of the camp's hierarchy, he was a fervent defender of the Ustaz regime and, showing enthusiasm for its brutal policies, rose rapidly through the ranks. Becoming one of the camp's top commandants, he was noted for his ruthless brutality and his emotionless torture and execution of prisoners. Along with other commandants, he was responsible for turning the camp into a site of some of the most horrific atrocities. He personally selected prisoners to execute and often performed mock surgeries to torture them. Many camp survivors who testified in post-war trials described his inhuman cruelty and penchant for torture and individual killings. He also participated in the infamous gambling event, where guards competed to see who could massacre the most people in one night. He also had a trained bloodhound that he used to attack prisoners at random. Following the collapse of the Ustase regime in 1945, Ljubo Milos attempted to flee. However, he was quickly captured and tried for his numerous crimes. He admitted to committing many murders and infamously declared, "I know I will burn in hell for what I did, but I will burn for Croatia." He was executed by hanging in 1948. Death in the execution fields, executions in the field. The Jasenovac Concentration Camp became synonymous with mass executions. Many prisoners died of hunger, disease, and the terrible conditions inside the camp. Others died due to forced labor and malnutrition, but many were simply systematically murdered. One of the most infamous forms of extermination was known as the execution camps. Located in the Gradina subcamp, these camps were the site of several enormous mass graves. There, prisoners were marched to the camps, often in the dead of night. They were then murdered en masse and quickly buried in the pits. When space ran out, many of the dead were simply thrown into the nearby Sava River. Over time, this method became the preferred form of execution. The Ustase would tie two prisoners together, hit one over the head with a sledgehammer, and then push them into the river. It is estimated that tens of thousands of people were murdered in the Gradina camps alone. Unfortunately, the scale of deaths at Jasenovac is somewhat difficult to determine precisely, primarily because the Ustase went to great lengths to destroy evidence and bodies. This occurred toward the end of the war and was admitted by many Ustase members who were subsequently tried. They recalled how they frantically exhumed bodies from mass graves, trying to dispose of them. To do so, they incinerated most of them in a crude manner, but this still failed to conceal their evil deeds. However, estimates suggest that between 80,000 and 100,000 people perished in the camp alone, not counting those murdered elsewhere in Ustase Croatia. Still, many historians convincingly argue that this figure is significantly higher, possibly exceeding 200,000 dead. And even with such an incredible loss of life, in the most horrific ways imaginable, there were survivors of that tragedy. Those who managed to escape had a tragic tale to tell. They spoke of the horrific conditions and brutal scenes of murder, and of the inhumane life inside the camp. Life at Jasenovac was the definition of a struggle for survival. Prisoners were crammed into ramshackle barracks, often with little protection from the elements. Roma prisoners, for example, didn't even have this. They were simply exposed to the open air, enduring rain, wind, snow, and other elements. Disease was therefore common at Jasenovac, as there was no sanitation, hygiene, or medical treatment whatsoever. Typhus, dysentery, and other illnesses spread rapidly among the malnourished and weak. No attempt was made to treat the sick. Instead, they were left to their own devices. Food was also scarce. Survivors in separate interviews stated that all they received was a stew made with water and only a few cabbage leaves. Sometimes they were given minimal rations of bread with this watery soup, and rarely pieces of meat or vegetables. Due to widespread starvation, many prisoners resorted to eating whatever they could find. Many eyewitness accounts speak of people eating grass, roots, and even insects. To make matters worse, those too weak to work were sent to the execution camps, where their lives were brutally ended. The workday at Jasenovac was long and grueling. Prisoners were forced to work from dawn to dusk, often in dangerous or physically grueling jobs. The camp included a brick factory, a metal workshop, and several other industrial facilities where prisoners were used as slave labor. Inmates who failed to meet their work quotas were often beaten or executed. Despite the terrible conditions, the prisoners at Jasenovac displayed remarkable resilience and solidarity. Many formed close bonds with their fellow prisoners, helping each other survive as much as possible. Some even managed to organize resistance efforts within the camp, sabotaging work projects or passing information to the outside. However, escaping from Jasenovac was nearly impossible, and those who attempted to flee were usually caught and executed. The last attempt, an organized escape from Jasenovac. Although conditions in the camp were similar to a living hell, the human desire to persevere and survive prevailed. Some prisoners in Jasenovac and its subcamps, covertly connected to the Communist Party's partisan movement, attempted to organize a secret escape effort. However, they struggled immensely to survive and concealed their activities and identities, which hampered their efforts. However, some survivors spoke in detail about their organized resistance and their attempts to maintain contact with the outside world and the Communist Party. Those communist activists whose identities were known had no chance of survival. Instead, the Ustase immediately executed them in various ways. Many were taken to Zone K in Jasenovac and imprisoned in so-called death cells, where they were kept without food or water until they died. However, those who were not identified as active communists continued their fight against the Ustase even in prison, but an escape attempt only became possible toward the end of the war. By 1945, it was already evident that the Axis forces were on the verge of defeat. Sensing imminent failure, the Ustase accelerated their brutality, driven by panic. The last victims at Jasenovac were a group of 700 women executed on April 21, 1945. That same day, the transfer and execution of the remaining 1,073 men in that subcamp was ordered. They were imprisoned in the Brickyard subcamp, where they soon realized that the Ustazi were dismantling Jasenovac and planning to execute all the prisoners. Unwilling to accept such a fate, the men formed a group of 600 volunteers and decided to attempt an escape, even though they were unarmed. They ran toward windows and doors, breaking them down under machine gun fire. Hundreds died, and of the 600 who attempted to escape, only 117 survived. The approximately 470 men who decided to remain in the Ladrilera subcamp were killed the next day and burned, along with the barracks where they were housed. Curiously, on the same day as the escape from the Brickyard, another attempt occurred at a different subcamp called the Tankery. Without contact with the prisoners at the Brickyard, this other group came to the same conclusion, fearing their fate. At that time, there were about 147 prisoners at the Tankery who devised a complex escape plan, separating themselves into several attack groups with specific tasks. The escape direction was set toward the vast fields behind the camp. Thus, on April 22, 1945, at around 8 p.m., the escape began. The attack groups, armed with rudimentary weapons, managed to kill 3 Ustazi guards and take their weapons. Another group overpowered the guards at the exit gate, while others alerted the prisoners and started fires to divert attention from the escape. However, the Ustazi quickly organized a pursuit. Fleeing to the fields outside the camp, the prisoners were pursued all night. Of all those who fled the tannery, only 11 managed to escape. The next day, the Ustazi abandoned Jasenovac. The desperately sought freedom, the liberation of Jasenovac. Many wondered why Jasenovac wasn't liberated earlier, while the war was still ongoing. The reality was that Jasenovac's geographical position made any rescue attempt a near impossible task. To the east and west of the camp lay swamps, while to the south and north the camp was surrounded by the Sava and Struga rivers. These rivers were patrolled by the Ustaše River Flotilla, and at the far end lay the main railway line, guarded by fortified bunkers and armored trains. Inside the camp was a contingent of around 1,500 elite Ustaše soldiers. All this meant that an attack on the camp would require a very large force, which was not available in the vicinity of Jasenovac, especially after the Kozara offensive between June 10th and July 17th, 1942, when the partisans were defeated by experienced Wehrmacht troops. The existence of Jasenovac was known to the partisan forces, and their leader, Tito, sent an order on March 31, 1942, to the operational headquarters of the partisan army to explore the possibility of a successful attack on the camp. During the failed First Banja Luka operation in 1943, the partisans managed to temporarily liberate the town of Bosanska Gradiška, just a few kilometers from Jasenovac. However, before advancing further, they were defeated by the combined forces of the Wehrmacht and the Ustaše. Thus, another attempt to approach the hell that was Jasenovac failed. By early 1945, the war was turning against the Axis powers. The Ustaše regime, increasingly pressured on all fronts, faced resistance from the Yugoslav partisans led by Josip Broz Tito, as well as the advancing Allied forces. The partisans waged a determined guerrilla war against the Ustaše and the Nazi occupiers, and were beginning to gain momentum in their fight to liberate all of Yugoslavia. By early 1945, it was clear that the Ustaše were on the verge of collapse. As the Allied forces approached, the Ustaše decided to abandon Jasenovac altogether. However, before leaving, they attempted to destroy evidence of the horrors committed there. By April 1945, many of the remaining prisoners were murdered and, on rare occasions, transferred to other concentration camps. Before finally withdrawing, the Ustaše blew up many of the camp's buildings, attempting to hide evidence of what had happened there. Still, the horror could not be hidden. The Yugoslav partisans reached Jasenovac in late April 1945, finding only a few scattered survivors who could recount what had happened. The official liberation took place on May 3, 1945, when soldiers from the 1st Infantry Squadron of the 1st Battalion of the 4th Serbian Brigade of the 21st Serbian Division of the Yugoslav Partisan Army entered the deserted grounds of Jasenovac. Seeing the atrocities before them, they were quickly assigned to preserve all evidence of the crimes until the State Commission to determine the crimes of the Ustaše arrived. The first report on the campgrounds and their condition was published by the District Commission for Enemy Crimes on May 11, 1945. Subsequently, the few survivors of the camp gave detailed accounts of the layout, conditions, murders, and daily fighting that occurred there. A month later, on June 18th, when the Sava River receded, revealing corpses, the Commission was able to complete and publish its third report on Jasenovac. The scale of the crimes was becoming evident to all, and with the emergence of the new Yugoslav state, it was time to bring those responsible to justice. The long hand of justice, post-war trials. As the war ended and the Ustaše regime collapsed, its leading figures fled wherever they could. The movement's leader, the infamous Ante Pavelić, escaped to Argentina, evading capture for several years. From this South American haven for fascists, Pavelić attempted to reorganize the Ustaše regime in exile. However, he was tracked down in Madrid, Spain, in 1959 and shot in broad daylight by a Serb, Blagoje Jovović. Ante Pavelić later died of his wounds. Another senior Ustaše leader who fled and evaded capture was the infamous Vjekoslav Max Luburić, known to many as Max the Butcher. A notorious sadist, Luburić was one of the most powerful men in the regime and head of the Jasenovac camp. His leadership at Jasenovac, beginning in 1942, transformed the camp into one of the most brutal in Europe, escalating the regime of torture, mass executions, and systematic extermination to hellish levels. A minor criminal before the war, Luburić used the rise of the Ustaše regime to escape punishment. Over time, he became one of its most fervent followers, known for his sadistic behavior and thirst for murder. His cruelty was matched by his fervor for Ustaše ideology, as he believed in the total elimination of non-Croatian populations from Croatia. His ruthless brutality made him one of the most feared men in the independent state of Croatia, and his name became synonymous with terror and suffering. However, when the war ended, Luburić fled, abandoning his men. He found refuge in Spain under the name Vicente Pérez, and lived under the protection of the fascist regime of Francisco Franco. From there, he continued his activities, spreading Ustaše ideology and continuing his policies in exile. In 1969, however, Luburić was assassinated in his luxurious villa by an agent of Yugoslav secret intelligence, a former Ustaše member named Ilija Stanić. When his attempt to poison him failed, Stanić killed him with a hammer, causing him to suffer in the same way as his victims at Jasenovac. Thus, many of the Ustaše's top brass fled after the war, but justice always found them in the end. However, many of the movement's lower-ranking members were quickly captured and imprisoned, then officially tried for their crimes, mostly in 1948. Found guilty on all counts, the top Ustaše leaders were sentenced to death by hanging, including men like Ante Vrban, Ljubo Miloš, Miroslav Filipović, and others. These trials brought some justice to the victims of Jasenovac, though even that could not erase their suffering. However, Jasenovac remained forever a symbol of extreme brutality and the chaos that emerged during World War II. It is often referred to as the Auschwitz of the Balkans due to the scale and nature of the atrocities committed there. However, the camp's legacy is also shaped by the region's complex and often bitter history. In the years following the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, the memory of Jasenovac became a point of contention, with different ethnic groups offering conflicting narratives about what happened there and why. Sadly, the number of victims who died at Jasenovac can never be accurately determined, as the fields around Jasenovac and the depths of the Sava River still conceal many bodies whose names have never been documented. The difficulty in establishing a precise death toll at Jasenovac is largely due to the systematic evidence destruction techniques implemented by the Ustaše in the final months of the camp's operation. Beginning in January 1945, with the imminent advance of the partisan forces, camp authorities ordered the opening of old mass graves to proceed with the massive disposal of bodies accumulated over the previous years. According to forensic records and reports from the State Commission for the Determination of Crimes Against Occupants and Collaborators, at least 83 mass graves were identified in the Gradina area, each averaging 12 to 15 meters long by 2 meters deep, although some exceeded 25 linear meters. Human remains were found in various states of decomposition, indicating multiple stages of burial and reopening. Destruction methods included open burning, using wood, tires, confiscated gasoline, and scraps of clothing as fuel. Quicklime was also applied, intended to accelerate the decomposition of soft tissue, although this generated calcified deposits that, paradoxically, facilitated the identification of denser remains such as skulls and long bones. In some areas, large metal drums containing charred organic remains were found, suggesting the use of industrial oils and animal fats as slow-burning agents. Following the camp's liberation in May 1945, partisan units reported intense odors of decomposing matter and areas of freshly turned soil in the areas surrounding the Sava River. Between May and June, researchers documented the recovery of more than 18,000 bone fragments, along with charred personal items, clothing fragments, and dental remains, which were catalogued and stored in temporary storage facilities. At the end of that same year, the first aerial photographs and topographical diagrams of the execution grounds were taken, marking areas of archaeological interest and delimiting priority sectors for excavation. These maps form the basis of the current layout of the Gradina Memorial and reveal that much of the land remains untouched, given that the volume of bodies exceeded the capacity for manual recovery under conventional forensic standards of the time. The Ustash's lack of detailed documentation and the active destruction of logistical archives and deportation records exacerbated the statistical invisibility of the crime. However, the physical existence of the graves, the preserved human remains, and the forensic evidence collected in 1945 offer structural confirmation of the mass extermination beyond the testimonies. Furthermore, the killers went to great lengths to destroy evidence of their crimes and of those they murdered. Because of this, the question of the exact number of victims at the camp remains a matter of intense debate. The fact that the Jasenovac archives were deliberately destroyed twice, in 1943 and 1945, further complicates the situation. Even so, official records indicate that between 200,000 and 700,000 people lost their lives in this terrifying hell. Pandemonium on Earth, remembering tragic fates. The Jasenovac Concentration Camp was a place of unimaginable suffering, a site where humanity's worst instincts were unleashed in a wave of genocide and cruelty. Though it may not be as well known as other concentration camps, its brutality shocked even the Nazis, who were no strangers to atrocities. The N4zi regime's campaign of ethnic cleansing, carried out with a level of cruelty that horrified even its German allies, left an indelible stain on the history of the Balkans and the world. It remains a reminder that evil knows no bounds and that religious differences between neighboring nations always end in bloodshed and great loss of life. Furthermore, Jasenovac is a testament to the inherently destructive policies of all fascist regimes, where all those who oppose such a worldview are mercilessly persecuted and killed. In the Balkans, however, where ethnic and religious divisions still persist, the memory of Jasenovac is a living wound. Infected and painful, this wound cannot heal, even 79 years after the end of the war. The descendants of all those who faced such a cruel fate at Jasenovac must live with the knowledge of the pain their ancestors endured, and forgiving and forgetting for them means abandoning the memory of their predecessors. To make matters worse, the ultranationalist views that still persist in the Balkans, particularly in Croatia, prevent these divisions from disappearing. There are still followers of the N4zi regime, and young people unable to grasp the magnitude of the evil that regime committed still see them as righteous warriors fighting for the Croatian cause. The truth, however, is far from this. But sadly, history remembers, and the name of the N4zi cannot be erased, not even after all the innocent blood shed at their hands. And so we remember Jasenovac. We remember the tragic fates many endured there, and we keep a flame of compassion burning for their suffering. In the meantime, we hope that history will not repeat itself in such a way, and that innocent blood will never be shed again.